Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining my talk. This is my first time doing B-sides for Greenville. I've meant to several times in the past, and it's just never really lined up with my schedule. Um, so I'm really happy to be part of this, even though it is remote. So my talk is it's a topic that is very dear to me, which is on writing, I guess, open source software for application security purposes. So kind of similar to the previous talk, but different. And most of what I'm going to be doing here is it's really kind of a show and tell on some of the projects that I've worked on. But I also want to get into a little bit of the technical details in case people are interested in doing some of their own. Yeah, so that's basically it. So it's about BurpSuite, but let me get into first of all my bio. My name's Jason Gillam. I wear many hats, sometimes far too many. So security consulting. I was teaching a class this week on application security. I also do software development. So a bunch of stuff. And I love application security. Although I do pen testing and various different aspects of that, application security is kind of where I'm really feel comfortable. So I'm an OWASP lifetime member. I'm a regular at other B-sides. This is, like I said, this is my first time here, but for those who know me, you've probably seen me before at B-sides Asheville or Charleston or Charlotte. I've worked with Chaha a lot in the past as well. I've been programming for a really long time. Hate to admit it, but yeah, my first computer was a Commodore VIC-20. It is the one that's actually on this slide. I saved up all my money when I was mowing lawns as a teenager, and went out and bought a computer, which was pretty awesome. And I started programming on it. Most of the other kids were playing games on it. I started tinkering with it. And in my spare time, when I get a little bit now and then, I really like craft beer enough that I actually brew some of my own. So the picture on here is one from, it's actually from a couple of years ago, but it's a stout that it was dry hopped. So that's what all the hops are on top there. That's dry hopping. So before I get into this, I know that my talk is going to be around Burp Suite extensions, and Burp Suite itself is a commercial tool, but I wanted to take a minute to acknowledge all of the open source tools that are out there, because we as information security professionals, we rely very heavily on open source tooling. The last whole presentation, I think everything in there, all the PowerShell stuff, I think everything in there was all open source tools, a lot of it extendable. And here's a bunch that are probably familiar to anybody who's in InfoSec. You should be familiar with at least some of the ones on here, on this screen here, especially on the red team side. I know more tools, open source tools evolving on the blue team side, or have been over the last several years. But if you're looking like from the attacker perspective, almost everything's always been open source. So we rely very heavily on that. I want to throw a couple names out there in case you haven't seen the names before. Okay, so these aren't the only people who do open source InfoSec projects, but here's a bunch of them. Thanks to all of these fine people for all of their contributions over time. It's been really great to be able to do our job on your shoulders. So very thankful for that. Now, to get into what I want to talk about. So for those of you who've done pen testing before, you should already know about Burp Suite. It's an interception proxy. It's the only real commercially available proxy, and there is a free version. You'll find it in Kali and other places. But for those who aren't, so this is one of the main tools that we use aside from the browser, which you're going to need a browser when you're talking to web applications. aside from the browser, the interception proxy is the thing that you're going to use most. There's more than one. There's open source version. OWASP Zap is extremely popular as well. But as far as commercially supported ones, it's BurpSuite. And the reason why I use it, I just prefer the tooling in it over Zap. And I basically, the company I work for, we've standardized on it. This is what we use. So it's for man in the middling your own traffic. So you're going to be taking, whenever you make a web request, it goes through that proxy, goes to the server, and then the response comes back through the proxy and then to your browser. And so in your proxy, you can get a history of everything that's gone on. And then you can also do things like take one of those requests and then rerun it and make some changes to it and build fuzzing tools around it and that sort of thing. I guess the essence of what I want to dig into here is the fact that Burp has an API. You can extend it to do more things. So Burp Extender allows you to do that. It's actually a very rich API. I'll get into some of that functionality in just a second. In terms of there's a lot of hooks in there. You can hook into a lot of different parts of what it does. It works with Java, Python, and Ruby. So if you have any sort of programming experience in any of those languages, you probably have the skills to extend Burp. Now, that being said, I will add a caveat in there, and that Burp itself is a Java application, right? So if you're going to extend it and you have expertise at all in Java, then that is probably the language you want to use. Even Portswigger, the makers of BurpSuite, they're going to tell you that, hey, although all of these are supported, Python is actually supported through Jython, and Ruby is supported through JRuby, which are basically Java wrappers around those. So from a memory management and program efficiency perspective, it's better to write an extension in Java because it's a lot easier inside Java to just load some more classes into the class loader than it is to load up an entire Python or Ruby interpreter. So and the other thing is the way that it loads those, it basically, you can only really run one or two extensions that are Python or Ruby at a time, whereas the Java extensions, you can actually load up quite a few without having a significant impact on the memory footprint. So, all right, so that's that part. So how does this work? How do we actually build these? So what you do is part of the API, and I'll show it to you in a moment. I'll get into some demos. I just have a few slides to go through first. The extender, iBurp extender, is the sort of the main interface. So it's all a set of interfaces for those familiar with Java. It's just a set of interfaces that you implement. Burp extender is it has just one method on it, which is register extender callbacks. So basically, you implement iBurp extender, and then you basically implement that register extender callbacks. Take that callbacks object, and then from there, that's where you can call into that to hook into the various different aspects of Burp. And what can you do with that? There's a bunch of very useful, cool things. So one of these is, one of the common ones is the iHTTP listener and iProxy listener, which basically let you hook into all of the Burp history. So you can, on the fly, examine requests and responses and even make some changes to them, which is really cool. So a lot of the stuff that Burp inherently has in it, you can extend that sort of functionality inside, like for the proxy history, and make your own changes to things. Which can be very good for certain types of scenarios. There's also a pairing here of the intruder payload generator and intruder payload processor. So both of these work around intruder, which is the fuzzing tool inside of Burp, and they let you you can generate your own dynamic fuzzing payloads with the generator. or you can process existing payloads with the payload processor. And I'm going to actually show you one of these in a couple minutes. And beyond that, you have the ability to plug into where the issues show. So I guess that's in the dashboard now, right? Because it's all changed from where it used to be. You can let's say you build an extension that is able to detect type of vulnerability that that BurpSuite doesn't natively find. You can have use the scan issue interface to add your own issues in there. Right, so then they show up in the dashboard along with everything else, which is kind of cool. You can also, as you've probably seen if you've used any extensions before, a lot of them have user interfaces. They have like extra tabs that show up on there. So there's this whole mechanism for building those. Now, if you're building a UI inside of Burp, like for an extension, I recommend that you go down the path of using IntelliJ for that, for your IDE. That is what PortSwigger already uses. I talked to them about this. So like building a new tab sort of interface around there is really not that hard. It's kind of a drag and drop sort of thing when you're using that. And then you can plug that in through the tab, text editor, message editor extensions. There's others too. This is just a sampling of what's there. And then there's a whole, like if you have custom session management, maybe it's some special type of token or something like that, or something that needs to be handled, you can actually build custom functionality around there. If it's, again, if this is for cases where it falls outside of the norm. Okay, so that's it for, that's actually pretty much it for slides. So I'm going to, hopefully everyone can see this. I am going to show, actually I'm going to drag that off. There we go. Okay, so this is BurpSuite. This is what it looks like. This is the pro version. There is a community edition which has some of the features disabled, like most of the automations disabled. The extender API is actually still available in the community edition as well. So there are a lot of extensions that will work without you having to put any money down on it, which is kind of nice. So we have on here, I'm just going to run through this very quickly, just a couple of these tabs because they're important to what I'm going to show after. So we have the target. What's really important here for what I'm working on today is the scope tab. So I have a silly little application that I've built just for demonstration purposes, and it's whitelisted here in the target scope, and that'll come into play a little bit later. I have a proxy. The proxy history tab is the next one, right? So under proxy, there's the history. We can see that I've visited exactly one location at this point in time. So I have a browser set up here with, like, let's say I'll just go to professionalevil.com here so we can see that as well. Whoops. And now you can see how, some more resources have been loaded. Again, if you've done a bunch of application security, you've seen this before. And then we have intruder. This is our fuzzing tool. Right, so if we have a request and we want to send that request multiple times to the server, but swap out different values, like we're using a list of payloads and we're going to try, a list of username, password combinations or something like that. As an example, you can use this. It's sort of a mail merge type of functionality. Repeater allows you can take a request, put it into repeater, and then send that request to the server multiple times. So far what I've talked about, this is all the built-in functionality inside of BurpSuite. And some of that functionality we'll look at extending in just a second here. Okay, so extender. Extender has, this is where the Burp extensions get loaded. You can actually load, you can bundle up an extension into a jar file and just load it directly here, which is what you're going to do if you're developing one, if you're working on it locally. One really nice thing about the way that they do their class loading on there is I can take like this nonce payloader, for example. I can unselect it. Okay. Now I can go to my, my source code on here, recompile, and then once that's recompiled, I can then just click this box again. So I don't have to actually delete it and then bring it back in. I just click the box again, and now it will reload from the whatever version of the jar file was produced from my IDE, right? So it has a fairly tight development cycle on there, which is what, one of the things that I aim for. I don't like to have like some lengthy, you press a button, you have to wait half an hour before you can actually use something again, or go through, 30 or 40 different steps to make it work. So this is just a couple of steps. It's not too bad. I can make some changes in the source code, bundle up another jar file, which just takes a couple seconds, and then load it back in very quickly, and then try it out. Some of them will have their own tabs. So, oh, wait, hang on, before I get to that, there's also the BAP store on here. This is definitely worth looking at here. So the BAP store, you can see that, and although it says store, all of these are free. I should point that out too. But it is, these are many of the extensions. They're not all of them that are out there, but these are many of the extensions that have been produced. Everything in here is open source. And they all extend the functionality of Burp in a variety of different ways. There's also like a rating system on there and that sort of thing, which is kind of cool. So lots of different things in there. So if you're doing a web app pen test and you're using Burp, and you run into some scenario where you're like, oh man, I wish I could see this information a little differently or a little better, or if I had a little extra tool to do something, before you start writing one, go check and see if somebody else already did, because there's a lot of stuff already out there, which is pretty cool. There's also the API tab on here, and if you're building against Burp, so you're making your own extension, you'll need to save these interface files. That's what this button is for down here, right? So that saves the interface files off. That way you can compile against them. So you'll need that. Okay. So let's look at an extension. So I'm going to look at CO2 first, which is an oldie but a goodie. And the reason I bring this one up is as time went on, when I first started into application security and discovered Burp and how awesome it was, I started building extensions when I needed them for various different purposes. And eventually, after I don't know, a year and a half of doing that, I'm like, I really need some way to keep all of these together, because a lot of other people want to use them. And so I bundled them all together into what I call CO2. And CO2 is a reference back to my home brewing. It's carbon dioxide, which is also happens to be the gas that makes you burp when you drink too much beer. So I'll just run through a little bit of the functionality here quickly. So we have SQL Mapper. So if you've used SQL Map before, or if you haven't, one thing that you'll notice when you do SQL Map even -H on there, but there's also a -HH for super help. It has many, many, many different options on there. And so I found, for me, I was always having trouble remembering, which option do I use for what, which switch to use. And then also stuff like where do I put, what do I need to double quote, or where do I single quote, just trying to figure out all of that, because it's a command line tool, right? So I made this thing here, and what you can do with this is you can take any request out of your history here. So I'm just gonna take this one here, and then you send it to. This is actually also demonstrates one of the other things you can hook into. You can hook into this context menu, which is really helpful. So I can send this to SQL Mapper, and then that opens that up inside of CO2, and now you can see the command has been basically built for you, which this one has a ton of cookies in it, but there we go. Okay, so now I can right click, copy that line, and then go into SQL Map and basically just from the command line, SQL Map space, and then just paste my line in there. It properly quotes everything. If you need to, let's say, not put the cookies in, you can unselect that. All of the functionality, or most of it anyway, because as it evolves, it's hard to keep up with. But most of the functionality is it's been mapped from SQL Map, has been mapped into the user interface here. So it allows you to dynamically build that command. So for example, like let's say you go into techniques and you're like, I don't want to do the time-based blind, that just takes too long. You can click that and then it'll automatically put that technique equals BSQUE. Now, how many people knew that off the top of their head? Probably not that many, right? It's one of those things I got to go research in the docs and figure it out, which is fine, but I'd rather just quickly do this, and then I can right click and copy that, and then away go on my merry way, which is makes this a whole lot easier. There is this auto run thing in here. I actually don't use that. I put that in there because I had several people ask, is there a way to run SQL Map directly from within there? And it's like, but I actually use it from the command line. So I'll run a command and then I'll up arrow and then tinker with it a little bit and then, run it again, that sort of thing. So I actually don't use the run directly out of here, but I know some people do. Okay, a couple other things right quick. So Laudanum, I will admit this particular tab does not work right now. So Laudanum is a project, it has worked in the past. It's for web shells, right? So when you find somewhere to get a shell onto a web application, this would be the type of file that you want to get on there. Now, Laudanum, the project itself, is an older shell. And what I was aiming for with this is I wanted to be able to dynamically build one that had some security features in it, but also gave you more of like using, basically using AJAX requests, gave you the feel of a real terminal, right? So you have a prompt on there, you could type something, hit enter, and that would send that, and then you see the response come back, and it would render it as if it was inside of a terminal. So that's kind of where I want to go with this one. I just really haven't had time to get back to it and do that, but it would support PHP, JSP, war shells, ASP and ASPX at least. And then there's some other possible ones there too that we could add. So that's the idea behind that one anyway. So a couple that I do use quite frequently. So the user generator I find extremely useful. There's a lot of cases that you're like, hey, I just need a list of users. Well, which users do I use? So, this is based off of census data. So one of the things is especially when you're sending fuzzing payloads, you have a list of things that you want to send into an application. We know that sending a bunch of things into an application can take time, right? So there's no way I can send a list of 1 million things in. That's just going to take too long. And it's going to put a lot of load on the application. And we want to be, if we can, we want to be nice to it. Our goal isn't to denial service every application that we pen test. So, so when we want a list of usernames, what we really want is a list of the most likely usernames that will work. And so that's what the goal of this this particular tab is, right? So let's say I have, let's say it's a website with functionality, and I know that it's functionality that relates to retirees. I'm going to say, okay, well, let's pick first names from the 1950s, because all of the data in here is pulled from census data, right? So it's the most common to least common, and that's how it's ordered. So I can say, let me take first names from the 1950s. And I go, click, all right, and it always, for some reason, scrolls down. And so the most common name from the 1950s was Michael, and then came David, and then James, John, Robert, William, Christopher, Joseph, Jennifer, Richard, and so on and so forth down the list. So if I'm looking for first names, that'll work for me. If I'm looking for surnames, I also have those, right? So I can just say, let's just add surnames. And those are the most common surnames, not based on date. That's just current census data. Right? So Smith, Johnson, Williams, Brown, right? So those are your most common surnames. You can also have it just like combine things. So let's say you know that the usernames tend to be first initial, last name for an organization. So what's the most likely successful candidates for that if you have no idea who actually works there? Well, you can add the combos on there. And you can guess that there's a good chance that there's going to be a J Smith, a J Johnson, an M Smith, a J Williams, an M Johnson, a D Smith. Like, so it basically, again, orders them by, what's most likely going to be available. Because I'm going to need it in a moment, I'm going to grab first names on here. Okay. So next, name mangler. This is very simple. I put in a name. I needed something because I knew, in this case, I knew who some of the people were that I was, and I was looking for a username harvesting flaw, but I didn't know what the format was for that they were using for their usernames. So if I put myself on here and just, you know, there's a couple of things you can do in there, but basically it gives you a bunch of different options. So I didn't have to manually go, okay, well, let's try J Gillam and Gillam J, and, you know, and it just basically spits out a list that recombines these in different ways. So that was that one. Cooler. So Robin Wood, DigiNinja, big shout out to him, and another open source developer who does a lot of pen testing as well. So he has one of old tool of his, Cool. And I asked him, I said, hey, do you mind if I take your tool and take the concept behind it and basically rebuild it into Burp? And that's what Cooler is. In this one here, what you do is you take, let me take Professionally Evil site. Oh, wait, hang on. That one's not going to have anything because it's 3 or 4. I don't know if this will refresh in there, hopefully. There we go. Okay. I needed the actual content to send it to Cooler. All right. So, you can send multiple at a time. And so the premise behind Cool is that people tend to use words associated with a website in their password for that website. So if we extract all of the words from a page, then one of the main purposes for that would be to see if any of those, someone's used one of these as a password. Right, so that's what Cooler is. So pretty simple. There's some configuration on there and word size and stuff. But at the end of the day, you get a bunch of words that came off of that page. And then you can copy all of those. Masher, notice also most of these end in ER. I was trying to keep with the naming convention inside of Burp. Okay, so I'm going to take my list from Cooler for this. So I take this list. And so you start off with an input list of words, and then what you're going to do is you're going to go, hey, the password specification, which I happen to know in this case, requires an alpha, uppercase, lowercase, numeric, and it needs to be anywhere between, let's say, 9 characters and 18. And then this actually creates a payload generator, and you can also generate samples on here. And the samples will be mixes of whatever was in the input. And it does start fuzzing them too. It'll start adding like the number 1 at the end. And if you have symbols that are required, then it'll start putting exclamation points and, you know, that sort of thing. The generator, if you use that, it basically just keeps going. It keeps generating them indefinitely. And that will show up under intruder. So if I go to payloads here under the payload type, since I've generated it, I can go to extension generated, and it should show up in this list here. There it is. I don't know why it's small. It's probably because I changed my font so you could see it better. Okay, so that's that. Yeah, and then there's a couple of other little bits and pieces on there. So now the problem that I want to show is, because one thing I did want to get into is a little bit more on developing one. I'll show you a little bit of source code in a second. So I have this mocked up silly little login thing, and if we run this, let's just run it with a random user. We'll just call it random. Okay, we have no user session with that user. If I try a user that I know is in the system called test, it says login error, try again. So basically the idea here is it's a login form, right? And then there's also this little profile link over here that I just threw this in here. And we're not authorized, we have to be logged in to get to that. So there is a harvesting flaw on here, but it's not a harvesting flaw that we could normally get through with the built-in functionality inside of Burp. And the reason is because what we can see if we analyze it, which we should always do, right? We analyze the request and response traffic. We realize that what's happening is when we click on something, when we submit something, like here was the user random, what's happening is we're getting a nonce back. In this case, it was a 0 because the user didn't exist. And in the next case where I put in test user, which I know is a known user in the system, I actually got a nonce back. That nonce was then used to attempt to log in. Okay, so if we're looking at the request here, it's the user was test, the password was password, and the nonce was whatever nonce was produced. And I won't go through verifying exactly how this works for you. I'll just tell you. So basically, it requires these 2 requests in order to log in. One to grab a nonce, and the second one to actually use that nonce to log in. The nonce only works once, right? So this is meant as a method of preventing you from being able to brute force through the login, or send a whole bunch of fuzzing traffic to it. If I just said, okay, well, let me try a bunch of users and a password list against this, and just keep reusing the same nonce, it would always fail. Even if I guessed the right password, it would still fail. And so that's kind of the way this is built. Now, it does have a bit of a flaw in that although I can't do that with the built-in tools in Burp, I could make my own. Just think about it. All I need to do is set up my intruder payload. So let me just pick one here. Like, let me take this one here. I'm going to send this to intruder. Okay, so if you haven't seen this before, again, this is like a mail merge type thing. So I have my users, I have my passwords, and then I have these nonces. So I need to figure out how I'm going to handle those. Okay, so I'm going to build a little solution for that. Actually, I already have it built, but I'll build the code around that, and I'll show it to you in a second. But before we do that, we need to know what are some valid users. So let's look at a slightly simpler version of this. And we know that the nonce that we get back is going to be a 0 when the user doesn't exist, and a longer string when the user does exist, right? And that's just by passing a user into this. So let's start with this. Okay, so I'm going to send that to intruder and clear this out. And for the user, instead of test, I want to get some actual usernames, right? So I'm going to go back to CO2. Remember how I had the user generator here? I'm going to take those. I'm going to pass them into, I'm going to pass those into intruder here. And then I start that attack. And it goes by very quickly, and I can tell by the length that there's at least a Kevin and a Jason in there, okay? And if I look inside the response, I can see those ones produced nonces. All these other names, I got a 0 back, right? So that's basically, for you, if you haven't seen this before, if you haven't seen a fuzzing attack before, that's basically how it works. We're looking for, in the results table, we're looking for what's different. What are the outliers? Okay, so Kevin and Jason are valid. So going back to here, if I set this up as a cluster bomb, sorry, not this one, number 2. We set this up as a cluster bomb. We have the test, the password, and the nonce. Cluster bomb is the attack type that tries combinations of things. Okay, so our payloads for this, our first payload is going to be usernames. So we can just type them in. I'll type in Kevin, I'll type in Jason. Okay. The second one was our passwords. So we need a password list. I happen to have a short password list. I'm going to need a short one because I need this to run fast. Okay. And then for the third one, this one gets a little bit tricky. So now we need to generate a nonce, and the nonce we know is based on the user, right? So if I go back to that proxy history and look at how that works, we pass in a user, we get back a nonce. Okay, everyone see that? So how are we going to make that work? Whoops. So what we do is, let me bring up, here's the nonce payload processor. And I basically have hard coded this whole thing. So I have the template of that request I was just showing you right here. Okay. And then I have, here's that, remember how I said, here's the one thing you have to implement, right? Register extender callbacks. So let me just zoom in just a little bit here. There we go. Okay. So register extender callbacks. In this case here, all I did was set the extension name from the callbacks, print some output into it, so that way I know the right version is loaded. And then I have a register intruder payload processor. And this whole thing actually is the payload processor. Payload processor has two extra things that you need to implement. One is the name, so that way you have a way for it to show up in the interface. And the other one is the actual processing method, which is process payload. And it takes the current payload, the original payload, and then the base value as parameters on there. And so based on those, I'm able to take an existing payload. So we're going to use the username as a payload, and then return back a replacement payload, a replacement version of that, which we're actually going to return the nonce. So the way this works in here, so inside this block, I don't know how easy that is to see, but I'll just tell you what it's doing. It's basically taking the username, so whatever value we've used for that, and it is constructing a request. That request is going to request a nonce, and we then parse out the nonce, and then we return the nonce. Okay, so not too hard. Hang on, one more. It's like, how far out did I zoom that? Okay, so going back into BurpSuite, that was our nonce payload. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy another payload for the generation of the payload, which is going to be our names, because we already have those. That's the Kevin and Jason we have in the first position, right? Going back to the positions here, the name was already here. So I'm going to use the name again for this payload position, but I'm going to then use my custom payload processor to swap that out for the nonce. So one of the payload processing things I can do is invoke the burp extension, and anything that I've registered through the callbacks will show up on here. So I have ASCII payloads as a different one, and then I have this nonce payloader. All right, so I'm going to invoke that. And that's everything that I need to do. So now I can start this attack. And it is, in this case, it's going to run very slowly because I'm making these extra requests out. And yeah, so this will take a little while. So while this is going, we can, let me just explain what we have here. We have the 3 different payload positions, and their values are actually showing up in the results table. And what we're looking for, again, is something that's different. So anywhere where the length is changed to something else. And that should tell us whether or not we've guessed the password for one of those 2 users, Kevin or Jason. Yeah, these are going slow. So once we've guessed that, then we'll be able to look into the next step, which is, can we actually log in with that account, and then what's inside of that that profile page that's in there. So one little trick, actually, if you have something that's processing along, is you can take the request and reverse that, and that way it kind of shows up at the top like this. Makes it a little bit easier to see right away when you see the length change on something. And there we go. Actually, there's one that just changed. So now that it has I'll sort on it so we can see what it is. Kevin's password is, not surprisingly, Star Wars. Okay, right? Because the length on that one was different. So that's the outlier, which is, we're always looking for the outliers. If I look at the response for that one, it says, success, you are logged in. All right, so I'm just going to let that keep going. And now I can go back to my application, try Kevin, and the password Star Wars. And we'll just sign in. And now it actually says you are logged in. And lo and behold, I'm able to get to the profile, which is just a dummy screen. It just doesn't say you are not authorized anymore. Now it says, hey, this is Kevin's profile. So something's tied to a session is working. All right. So we've been able to log in with the nonce, and we can actually see what happened here in the final version of it. We used Kevin and his password. And we actually won't, I don't think we'll see in the history. Hang on. Kevin, yeah, there we go. So first it was Kevin, and we got the nonce back. And then in the post, right after that, Kevin, his password, and that same nonce was used. And then we were able to log in with that. Now, when we go to the profile, oops, let me look at the request here. One thing that you'll notice on this one is there are a whole bunch of cookies in here. I've just set a bunch of dummy cookies, which might make it hard to figure out, well, which one of those are actually important for the session and which ones aren't. So Parameter, and I'll get to that in just one second, but it ties right into Parameter, which is another plugin, that extension that I've been working on. And this one initially started with a, hey, I just want to be able to see what everything is inside when I have a really big test that I'm working on, you know, a very busy application, or maybe I'm going across multiple applications. And so what you do is, well, let me go back just one second here. What you have to do is, first of all, it only analyzes what's in your target scope. It only analyzes what's in your target scope. I have to say that twice because people go, like, hey, nothing came up. So once that happens, it will analyze your burp history only, right? And it just basically puts everything out into this nice table. It does its best job at identifying things. Like here we have this value here. It says, if you just click on one of them down here in the details in the bottom left, in the middle, it'll say, hey, what is that? And it says, yeah, it's a hex string of 40 characters in length. So it's probably a SHA-1 hash, right? And it'll give you a few other details on here as well. It'll also do its best guess at guessing which one of these would be considered secrets or things that you want to protect in some way, okay? So, and that's just purely based off the name, really. So now that we have that much information on here, one thing that we might want to do is go, okay, looking back at that proxy history on here, we have all of these. We might want to know which ones of those are important for managing session and which ones are just basically garbage tokens. I like to call them sometimes, that are maybe used for like analytics or something like that. And one way of doing that is, like you can manually go into, I can send this to repeater and then just, you know, one by one eliminate them and see how my response changes. I got tired of doing that. I'm lazy. So instead of doing that, I decided to spend hours trying to come up with a solution to do it for me. So what I did is I took this one here and send this over to Parameter. So you can do it from anywhere in there, but basically you take any request. Ideally, what you want is you want a request that is a good one to use as like a heartbeat of, am I still logged in, right? So going to a user's profile would be one. It's not making any changes, right? You don't want, because this is going to automate some testing on here. But it's easy to tell whether or not the user is still logged in if you're trying to access their profile, right? Because if the session cookie isn't right, it shouldn't give you their profile. If it does, then you have another whole problem on there. So I can send this to Parameter. And what it does is underneath the Sessions tab, it opens this up, and you can first of all verify the baseline. I like to do that first. So that's basically run that same request again, and I can verify in the response that it says, hey, this is Kevin's profile. So I know that that's still working. The baseline's still going to be accurate. And then all you have to do is hit this Analyze button, and it makes all of those requests. It literally took less than a second. And then based on those requests, again, we're looking for outliers. That's what we do, right? And we see that, hey, yeah, the only outlier on here is the session_ID. So what this means is it's most likely that the session_ID is the only cookie that we need to be considered logged in. And all of these other ones are just garbage cookies. You can right click on any of these, and I've built in, again, through the Burp APIs, you can build in context menus to send a request to other tools. So I can send one of these to Repeater. All of that was built in through that. Okay. So I think I'm right near the end of my time. Let me just, I have a couple of closing things. Let me bring up PowerPoint again, if it'll work. All right. So a couple closing things. Many open source tools out there are extendable, and some commercial ones are as well. Okay, so just because a tool doesn't do exactly what you need it to do, that doesn't mean it's incapable of that. And often those of us who write these tools, we write them to be extendable. I mean, there's lots of examples out there. Tim Tomes, again, I'll throw his name out there, ReconNG. That's always been a very much a modular framework, right? It's meant to be extended. Nmap is another one. You can build scripts, additional scripts onto Nmap, which we all use for port scanning purposes. Zap, of course, and Burp, and then even if you look at like the previous presentation, there were several tools like PoshR2, extendable tools, right? So bear that in mind. I mean, our tools get better when we have feedback and additions and we actually look at how can we improve on these things. Second, everybody, like, please support open source development. That doesn't mean you have to develop the stuff, right? It also doesn't mean you have to donate money to it or anything like that, but you can help in other ways. Report issues. If you see something that's broken, don't just go, oh, that tool's broken. Maybe they're not maintaining it, and then don't say anything, right? I know that I have, like in CO2, I know that there are things broken in there that nobody has reported, and I lazily have not actually opened an issue for them. But if somebody reported it, I'd go, okay, well, somebody wants that fixed. And so that would get my attention, and then when I get some time, I'll get around to it and I'll fix it. I don't expect pull requests for things like CO2. It is I would like to say it's a well-written Java extension for BurpSuite, but it's all the documentation for it's really in my head. So I don't expect anyone else to be able to make sense of my crazy ideas in that case anyway. Also though, share ideas. Get together with developers of tools, and if you have an idea for, hey, how could we make this better? Share it with them. I mean, I'm very passionate about my tools. I would love for people to talk to me about them and say, hey, have you thought about maybe using it this way? Or could you add this functionality to it? I'm glad to entertain that. And I'm not going to say, well, go submit a pull request, right? I will for some things, but generally not for my Burp extensions. You can help with docs, like user documentation or videos, useful videos, that sort of thing. And just, express some thanks. I know a lot of people do. I often forget way too often to say thank you to all of the people who have built solutions and put them out there for the industry to use, because our industry is built on open source. It really is. So that's it for my talk. My name again is Jason Gillam. If you want to chat with me at any time, either later today or any time afterwards, I can be found on a Slack channel, professionalevil.com. And my GitHub repo it's J Gillam, it's first and last name, if you're trying to find me and some of the tools that are out there. So thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jason, for contributing your knowledge back to the community. Some of those statements you made right at the end, though they weren't specific to your presentation, were really hard-hitting for something that all of us should keep in mind, that this community is built on all of our contributions, and you're an example of it right now. And I'm an example of it hosting this room, and we're all an example of it consuming it and hopefully giving back to the community.